In this lesson, we'll be focusing most of our time on the accent color, which we named striping earlier on in a previous lesson. So far, we use alphas applied to our brush to get the Substance logo on the front and the stripes on the side. This time, we'll apply stamps using a different technique by using stencils. Now, Substance ships with a lot of great alphas, but there will come a time where you want to import your own stuff. So let's go ahead and import our stencil sheet onto the project. I can simply drag and drop an image from the Explorer to the shelf, but instead, I'm going to go ahead and just click on the Import Resources button by the shelf. This will bring up the Import Resources dialog. I'll first go to the Add Resources and select our stencil sheet. Now, before we can start using this, we need to define a few parameters so Painter can recognize things a little bit better. First, let's define what type of resource this is. I'll click on the undefined area, and since this is just a black and white image, we'll go ahead and just choose alpha. Now that we've defined our type, we can also optionally add a prefix to the resource to allow for easier searching. Let's type in Big I. Lastly, there's the Import Your Resources To dropdown. There are three choices. Current session will keep this resource only for the current session of Painter you're using. Choosing Project will save the image along with the project file, which could be handy if you're pushing files from computer to computer. Lastly is Shelf, which will permanently place it into your Painter shelf, which is going to be good if you plan to use this on future projects. For now, I'll just pick Project. Our stencil sheet is now imported under alphas, and if I type in Big I in the search bar, you can isolate what we just brought in. So let's start stenciling in some decals. Let's head over to the striping layer by getting to the Base Paints folder and selecting the striping mask. Now instead of using the alpha of the brush, there is this area called Stencil. We can simply drag our imported image onto that area and our screen will overlay with the stencil sheet. I'll just remove the alpha from my brush so we can get rid of any fading that may occur. And make sure I'm painting a white value and paint over one of the areas. Essentially what I'm doing is using this stencil to paint through, very much like a stencil in traditional art. I'll remove the stencil just to see the final result. So we're going to get rid of some of our earlier stamps by choosing a black value and just erasing some of these areas. And I'll reapply the stencil and choose a white value. Now to manipulate the stencil, you can hold S and middle mouse to move it around. Holding S and left clicking will rotate the stencil. And finally, holding S and right clicking will scale the stencil. And much like the viewport controls, if I rotate and hit Shift, it will snap the stencil to the closest plane. Okay, so let's go ahead and just place this Pluralsight logo where the Substance one was. I'll use the 2D viewport to do this, and to get a better alignment and scale by using the S and right clicking. So, like the last lesson, I'll use the stencil sheet and begin adding some visual interest to my mesh. Using the same principles as before, I'm going to go ahead and just place details in areas that I want the eye to go towards, and really just have some fun with it. You won't always get it right the first time, so experiment. It's easy to remove these and reapply as necessary. I'll enable symmetry here to quickly get some details on both sides of the mesh, rotating and moving the stencil around as necessary. The antenna balls will do this in the 2D canvas and erase the stuff that we did earlier, and we're going to reapply this with the decal. Note that I'm not using symmetry for painting these text layers. That's because you'll get reverse wording on the other side. Once I'm done with the text, I'll go and re-enable the symmetry and just redraw that line. I'm holding Control and Shift to do a straight line. And this is not always going to work out the first time, so I do use the undo a lot. Working on the front canister, again without any symmetry plane, and just carefully get in the areas that I need. We don't want to forget about the back portion, so I'm just going to add a few details here. Of course, you don't have to use the stencil sheet to do this. You can always just paint into the mask, as I'm doing here with a soft brush. I'll enable symmetry and paint in a white value into the mask, always holding down Shift to create a straight line when needed. I'll go to the 2D canvas to add some lines to the canister in front, and tidy up some errors as we go along. Let's start moving on to the legs. I'll use symmetry to get these details on as fast as possible, and carefully place in these hash marks. Just make sure that you're on the striping layer mask. I'll turn off symmetry and do some print again, And if you're following along, don't feel that you need to do exactly what I'm doing. Always experiment and try things out. Painter allows this very organic workflow, so don't be afraid to see if something works. And if you're unsure, you can always undo and re-stencil. And we'll just finish up with a couple of details on the back and take a step back to look at our model. So we're finally starting to get some nice colors onto our mesh, and in the next lesson, we'll push things even further by adding some emissive lights.